Will come to order, but before we begin, I just want to take a moment to remember Senator Frank Lautenberg. He was a very passionate public servant who was not afraid to fight and vote for what he believed in, and I think it's important to note this morning that he was ranking member of this committee from 1997 to 2000 and helped negotiate the Balanced Budget Act of 1997, which produced the first balanced budget in decades. Frank made tax relief and support for middle-class families a priority constantly, and he promoted a responsible approach to our deficit and budget challenges. Frank was somebody who gave everything he had to public service, and those who served with him know that that's what gave him satisfaction constantly. He will be missed by all of us on this committee in particular, and I think I join with all of my colleagues in letting his family know he's in our thoughts and prayers.
Madam Chairman, thank you for making reference to our friend Frank Lautenberg. He was a great senator, a good friend. I really liked him. He understood, of course, as a highly accomplished businessman, he understood the economy and how the system worked in an extraordinary way. And a lot of people might not know that he landed on D-Day. He always, I used to say that he would correct it every time because he landed about 3 weeks after the Normandy invasion, and he didn't want to claim that he was there at the beginning, but he was there, and the last, I guess, surviving World War II veteran that we had. So a real patriot, a man of great accomplishment, and thank you for making reference to his fine service.
Thank you very much. With that, let me thank my ranking member, Senator Sessions, all of our colleagues who are joining us here today, and all the members of the public who are here and watching online. I want to begin by thanking our witnesses, Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary under President Clinton and NEC Director under President Obama, and now Charles W. Eliot Professor at Harvard University. We also have Simon Johnson, Ronald A. Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship at MIT Sloan School of Management and a Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and Salim Firth, who is a Senior Policy Analyst for Macroeconomics at the Heritage Foundation. I really appreciate all of you coming today and sharing your expertise. The topic of today's hearing is the fiscal and economic effects of austerity. This is a subject that has received a lot of attention recently, and it is important for those of us here on the Budget Committee to understand it as we work with our colleagues across the Senate to negotiate a budget deal between the House and Senate, replace sequestration, write and pass spending bills for the next year, and make sure we're making the investments we need in jobs and long-term economic growth. I have long believed that the case for austerity during times of economic weakness has been fundamentally flawed. When demand falls off in the private sector and millions of workers are losing their jobs, I think the last thing government should do is make things worse by slashing spending and causing aggregate demand to drop even further. When the economy is struggling, government should act to make things better for the middle class and most vulnerable families by investing in jobs and economic growth that not only boosts demand in the short term, but also lays down a strong foundation for long-term and broad-based growth for years to come. That was the theory behind the Senate budget that we passed that put jobs and the economy first. It is one shared by the vast majority of economists across the political spectrum, and it is one of the many reasons I believe the House budget is wrong for our country and our economy. In recent weeks, however, it has been made clearer than ever that the case for short-term austerity is not just the wrong way to go, it's flat out wrong. A very specific claim in an academic paper cited frequently by many of my Republican colleagues on this committee to make the case for short-term austerity was found to be flawed. And recent changes in deficit projections have made it clear that despite the claims of some of my colleagues, there is no short-term debt or deficit crisis. We have serious long-term deficit and debt challenges that we need to tackle. We certainly don't want to leave our children and grandchildren with an unmanageable pile of our bills. But we have made significant progress recently when it comes to our short and medium-term deficits. And now the focus should be on creating jobs, preserving our fragile recovery, long-term deficit reduction, and setting the conditions for economic growth built from the middle out. Since the Simpson-Bowles Commission's report in 2010, we have worked to reduce the deficit by $2.4 trillion, disproportionately through spending cuts. And to be clear, that $2.4 trillion is the amount of deficit reduction before counting the $1.2 trillion in savings that will come from either sequestration or, as proposed and passed by this committee in the Senate in March, an alternative approach that replaces the damaging automatic cuts with a responsible and balanced mix of spending cuts and new revenue. A few weeks ago, the Congressional Budget Office released its latest baseline, which gave us an updated view on our debt and deficits. These revisions show we've made more progress on reducing our short and medium-term deficits than we thought. CBO now estimates that the deficit for 2013 will be over $200 billion less than its February projection. This means that in the 2 years, from 2011 to 2013, CBO expects the deficit will have been cut in half. That's welcome news. And again, it makes clearer than ever that now we need to focus above all else on our fragile economic recovery, and that the case for austerity in a time of economic weakness is simply wrong. History has shown us that austerity isn't the right way to boost economic growth in the short term, especially during times when the economy is still recovering as it is right now. Our experience as a country following the Great Depression in the 1930s showed us how turning to austerity too quickly can have serious consequences for economic recovery after a time of crisis. And Europe's recent adoption of austerity policies has yielded similarly negative results. Countries across Europe have experienced economic downturns that have exacerbated or been prolonged by austerity policies. Right now, we're seeing how the indiscriminate and irresponsible cuts from sequestration are hurting our economy. When I was back home in my home state of Washington last week, I heard story after story after story about the impact they're having on families and communities. I met with a man named Elliot Gregg in Kitsap County in my state who runs the Kitsap Credit Union. Elliot's credit union has been part of that community for decades, and it's grown with the thousands of Navy families who call Kitsap home. Even though sequestration has been just in effect for a few months, he is seeing dramatic impacts. Families hoping to buy their first home or purchase a car are telling him, with furloughs and layoffs looming, they can't take out loans they might not be able to pay back. They do not understand why Congress will continue along the path of deep and indiscriminate cuts, and frankly, I don't either. During this time when our economic recovery is real but remains fragile, experts agree we should be instead investing in job creation and economic growth, and continuing on the path to austerity right now would weaken our economy and do serious damage to job creation and growth. Not only is austerity bad for short-term economic growth, but it also hurts our ability to lay down a foundation for long-term, broad-based growth and prosperity. As a country, we have to continue to invest in the programs we need to compete globally in the 21st century economy, the kinds of investments that make our country stronger. In fact, the bipartisan Simpson-Bowles Commission highlighted the importance of, and I quote, investing in education, infrastructure, and high-value research and development to help our economy grow, keep us globally competitive, and make it easier for businesses to create jobs. Investing in infrastructure like roads and bridges creates jobs today, but it also makes our families safer and lays down a strong foundation for long-term economic growth. I, in fact, saw this firsthand at home in my home state, where on Friday a week ago, I saw the devastation that was caused by an entire section of Interstate 5, which collapsed into the Skagit River. This is the kind of disaster that we can expect when our roads and bridges have outdated designs or fall into disrepair. And it should certainly be a wake-up call that we need to invest in repairing our crumbling roads, bridges, and highways. And by the way, that isn't just having an effect on the highways, it's having an effect on every business surrounding there where they've seen a tremendous loss of business because of the collapse of this bridge. Thankfully, by the way, no one was seriously injured. We're beginning work on a temporary and a long-term repair, but our families have been seriously disrupted by this, and it is really a wake-up call to all of us about what we need to be focusing on. By strengthening our transportation systems, we are helping to connect people across town and across the country, and this will create a more productive environment for American businesses to grow over the long term. Now, the same is true for our investments in people and schools. Investment in education through programs like Pell Grants and worker training are some of the smartest the federal government can make to boost our economy in the long term. If our businesses are going to be creating 21st century jobs, we need our students and workers to have 21st century skills. And in order to maintain our edge in innovation, we need to keep investing in research and development. These types of investments have led to private sector growth, and they've led to new industries and new drugs and new inventions and new jobs. If we fail to maintain these important investments, we could lose our position as a global leader in research and technology. But taking the path of austerity would cut these national investments in infrastructure, in education, and research that help make sure we leave our children a stronger country than the one we received. And it would weaken our economy in the short and long term. Now, this debate can sometimes seem academic, but it has very real implications on policy decisions that we make here in Congress. I am extremely frustrated that some Republicans here in the Senate are blocking us from moving to a bipartisan budget conference where we could work together to move away from the constant lurching from crisis to crisis and get back to regular order my Republican colleagues have claimed they wanted. But even though we don't yet have a budget agreement, over the next few weeks, our appropriations committees are now beginning to make some key decisions about our discretionary spending for fiscal year 2014. And they are going to face this choice between a path of austerity or an approach that maintains critical investments in our families and communities. Senate Democrats believe the path of austerity that long-term cuts from sequestration lead toward is not the right direction for our country. That's why we are going to continue to work to replace sequestration with a balanced mix of responsible spending cuts and revenue from those who can afford it the most. And that is why the Senate Appropriations Committee, led by Chairwoman Mikulski, will maintain a $1.058 trillion cap during this process, the amount of discretionary spending that we agreed upon in the Bipartisan Budget Control Act. House Republicans, on the other hand, will be writing their spending bills at the overall level that assumes sequestration will continue, $967 billion. And to be clear, House Republicans are not keeping to the Bipartisan Budget Control Act. They are violating it by shifting funds from non-defense programs in order to keep defense spending at pre-sequestration levels. We all know sequestration was never intended to be implemented, so we should be focused on replacing it, not trying to make an unworkable policy just a bit less bad. The difference between $1.058 trillion and $967 billion may seem abstract, but we are going to continue to see the very real impact the spending cuts of sequestration are having on our veterans, our students, our seniors, and our families, not just today, not just tomorrow, but for years and years to come. Already, House Republicans are recognizing the impact this approach has on our ability to maintain important national investments. Their own budget places severe restrictions on spending levels for critical programs like our national defense, education, and health care spending, and so they are taking funding from some parts of the budget to pay for others. Robbing Peter to pay Paul is not the right way to set our priorities as a nation. It's a gimmick, and as we will see over the next few weeks, the House Appropriations Committee is going to be highlighting the fact that even they know their budget levels, which are worse than sequestration, are not practical and not sustainable. My colleague, the Republican chair of the House Appropriations Committee, said, and I quote, "This is clearly an austere budget year." And he did not mean that in a good way. As we continue in this appropriations process, I hope we can all keep in mind a clear vision for what will create economic success and broad-based prosperity in the short term and over the long term. So I'm very glad that we're having this very timely discussion today. We owe it to the American people to come together around a responsible vision for building a foundation for growth and restoring the promise of American opportunity. And I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses today about this important subject in just a few minutes. With that, I would like to turn it over to my ranking member, Senator Sessions,